The day my father was buried, my brother handed me a document and told me to sign it before the guests finished their coffee. I remember standing there in my black dress, still holding a crumpled tissue from the graveside service, staring at the papers like they were written in a language I didn't speak. My brother, my older brother, the one who used to carry me on his back when I was 6, was looking at me with this flat, impatient expression. Not grief, not guilt, just impatience. "It's just a formality," he said. "Probate stuff. Dad would have wanted us to handle this quickly." I didn't sign. Something in my stomach told me not to. And that instinct saved my life, or at least, saved everything my father had ever worked for. My name is Odette. I'm 34 years old. I work as a dental hygienist in Charlotte, North Carolina, and up until 8 months ago, I thought my family was complicated, but fundamentally decent. The kind of complicated where holidays get a little tense, where old resentments bubble up over wine and then everyone goes home and pretends it didn't happen. I thought that was as bad as it got. I was wrong. My father, Edmund, passed away in March from a second heart attack. The first one, 2 years earlier, had been a warning he mostly ignored. He kept working, kept eating badly, kept saying he'd slow down after this one last project. He was 68 years old, and he was the kind of man who genuinely believed he could out-stubborn his own body. He almost made it work. He left behind a house in Concord, a 4-bedroom craftsman he and my mother had bought in 1991, when the neighborhood was still considered a stretch for them financially. My mother passed when I was 19, breast cancer. After she died, my father poured everything into that house. He refinished the floors himself. He built a pergola in the backyard. He planted her rose garden every spring because she had started it, and he said it would be wrong to let it die. That house was worth, at last estimate, around $380,000. Not a fortune by some standards, everything to ours. My brother's name is Fletcher. He's 43 years older than me, and he's always carried this low-level resentment about being the responsible one, the firstborn, the one who stayed closer to home while I moved 2 hours away for school and then stayed. He married a woman named Simone 6 years ago, and I tried hard to like Simone. I really did. But she had a way of looking at things, furniture, houses, people, like she was constantly appraising them, deciding what they were worth to her. I should have paid more attention to that. The week before my father's funeral, while I was still driving up from Charlotte to help with arrangements, Fletcher called me to say he'd already handled the will situation. I asked him what that meant. He said Dad's attorney had retired and the documents were being transferred to a new firm, and he'd spoken to them, and everything was straightforward. I was exhausted and grieving, and I said okay. That was my second mistake. The first was trusting that my brother and I wanted the same things. The document he handed me at the reception, I found out later, after I'd taken it to my own attorney, was a quitclaim deed. It would have transferred my legal interest in the property entirely to Fletcher. The language buried it in boilerplate, sandwiched between paragraphs about estate administration and processing timelines. If I hadn't had that pull in my gut, if I hadn't been just stubborn enough to say I need to read this first, it would have been done. Notarized. Filed. Gone. Fletcher was furious when I didn't sign. He kept his voice low because we were surrounded by my father's friends and our aunts and cousins. But I could see it in his jaw, the way he kept working it like he was chewing something bitter. He said I was making things difficult. He said Dad had talked to him about wanting the property handled efficiently. He said the attorney would explain everything, and I just needed to trust the process. I nodded and said I'd look it over. He didn't speak to me again for the rest of the reception. That night I sat in my father's kitchen. The kitchen where he'd taught me to make biscuits, where he'd helped me with homework at the table by the window. And I read every word of that document 3 times. And then I called my father's oldest friend. His name is Theodore. He and my father had known each other since they were both young men, working at the same textile plant in the early 80s, before the plant closed and they both found different paths. Theodore had been at every birthday party, every Christmas, every graduation. He had stood 2 rows behind me at the graveside that afternoon with tears running openly down his face, not embarrassed about it at all. Theodore answered on the second ring. I told him what had happened. I told him about the document. There was a long silence and then he said, "Baby girl, don't sign a single thing. You hear me? Not one thing." He came over the next morning with coffee and a name. The name was his nephew, who had just made partner at an estate law firm in Charlotte. Theodore had already called him. His nephew, a focused, quietly intense man named Dominic, agreed to review the documents that same week. What Dominic found made my hands shake. The quitclaim deed was only the beginning. Fletcher had also submitted an amended will to the probate court, an amendment that had supposedly been signed by my father 6 weeks before his death. In the amendment, my father clarified his wishes to leave the Concord property solely to Fletcher, with a small cash sum set aside for me in lieu of real property. The original will, which my father had filed with his longtime attorney, who had not, as it turned out, fully retired, just scaled back his practice, split everything equally between us. Dominic requested copies of both documents. He brought in a forensic document examiner. The signature on the amendment was close, really close. It had my father's characteristic backward lean and the oversized loop on the E. But the pressure patterns were wrong, the spacing between letters inconsistent in a way my father's signature never was. The examiner's report used careful, professional language. What it meant, in plain terms, was that someone had practiced my father's signature and was very nearly good enough. Very nearly. I sat in Dominic's office on a Tuesday morning and felt something I didn't have a word for. It wasn't just betrayal. It was more like the floor dropping out from under an entire version of my life. The version where my father's house was just a sad thing I'd have to figure out what to do with, where Fletcher and I would argue about logistics, and then eventually divide things fairly, because that's what family does. That version was gone. In its place was something uglier and more deliberate. I thought about Simone appraising the pergola at Christmas. I thought about Fletcher saying, "Dad would have wanted this handled quickly." I thought about the way he'd stood at the reception, not looking at the photographs of our parents on the mantel, just watching me. Waiting. My first instinct was to call him, to ask him directly, to give him a chance to explain or deny or confess or something human. But Dominic advised me not to. Once he knows you know, he said, things start moving, documents disappear, accounts get touched. Let us build the picture first. So I went home to Charlotte. I worked my shifts. I smiled at patients and asked about their kids and handed over the little bags of floss and sample toothpaste. And every evening I drove home and sat with this thing living inside my chest, this knowledge I couldn't tell anyone except Dominic and Theodore. Theodore called me every few days. He never made it dramatic. He'd just ask how I was holding up, tell me some small story about my father, things I hadn't heard before, things from before I was born, when they were both young and broke and full of plans. It helped more than I can explain. It made my father feel present somehow, like Theodore was carrying pieces of him and handing them to me a few at a time. Meanwhile, Dominic had been digging. The notary on the amended will was a woman who worked out of a UPS store in Kannapolis. Dominic's paralegal found that the same notary had also notarized 3 documents for a limited liability company that Fletcher and Simone had incorporated 14 months earlier, an LLC with a name that sounded like a property management company. Further digging revealed that LLC had made 2 inquiries to a developer about the Concord property. Dated before my father died. They had been planning this before he was gone. I want to stop here and tell you something because I think it matters. My brother is not a monster in the way that word usually gets used. He's not violent. He's not reckless. He's a careful, organized man who works in logistics and is good at spreadsheets, and probably told himself some version of a story where this was fair, where he deserved more because he'd done more, where I had my own life and didn't need the house the same way he did. I've spent a lot of hours trying to understand how someone gets there. I still don't, entirely. But I stopped trying to make it make sense sometime around the 3rd month, when my attorney filed the formal challenge to the probate, and Fletcher's attorney sent back a letter that was so coldly aggressive. It felt like reading something written about a stranger. Whatever brother I thought I had, he had made different choices than I knew. The probate court challenge moved slowly, the way legal things do. There were filings and responses and a mediation session that accomplished nothing except making me sit in a room with Fletcher and Simone for 2 hours, watching Simone take notes on a yellow legal pad like she was in a business meeting. Fletcher barely looked at me. When he did, it was with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Something calculating and remote, like he was looking at a problem to be managed rather than his sister. I drove home from that mediation and sat in my parking lot for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. But the document examiner's report was solid, and Dominic found one more thing that mattered. A text exchange, obtained through the legal process, between Fletcher and Simone from 5 weeks before my father's second heart attack. In it, Simone wrote, "We need to get this done before anything happens. Once he's gone it gets complicated. Fletcher working on it. I don't know what it referred to exactly. The amended will, the LLC, some conversation with my father they hoped would change his plans. Dominic said we didn't need to prove what it meant. The timestamp and context said enough. The probate court ruled in my favor 7 months after my father's funeral. The amended will was found to be fraudulent and thrown out. The original will was reinstated. The property would be split equally between Fletcher and me, as my father had intended. The district attorney's office opened a separate investigation. As of when I'm telling you this, charges for forgery and fraud have been filed against Fletcher. Simone has retained her own attorney. I don't know how it will end. I don't let myself spend too much time imagining the possibilities. What I know is this: the house in Concord is still standing. My father's rose garden is still there. I went back last month and walked through every room and let myself cry in the way I hadn't let myself yet. Not the grief around other people crying, not the holding it together crying, but the real kind, the ugly kind, sitting on the floor of his bedroom with my back against the bed he'd slept in for 30 years. Theodore came by while I was there. He didn't knock, just came through the side gate the way he always had, and found me in the backyard. He sat down on the bench my father had built, and didn't say anything for a while, just sat. The roses were just starting to come in. It was early May, and they were at that stage where they're mostly bud, but you can see the color beginning. "Your daddy would have fought for you," Theodore finally said. "You know that." I told him I knew. "He'd also tell you not to let this be the thing that defines you," he said. He was particular about that. About not letting hard things make you hard. I've been thinking about that a lot. About how grief can go bad if you're not careful. How it can curdle into bitterness, into a closed-off way of moving through the world. My father was a man who built a pergola and planted roses after the worst loss of his life. He chose to tend things. He chose to keep making something. I'm not ready to sell the house. I don't know if I ever will be. I've been talking to a property manager about renting it for now. Keeping it in the family until I figure out what the right thing is. Fletcher's attorney reached out last week to discuss a buyout option, which I found almost impressive in its audacity. I haven't responded yet. What I keep coming back to is this: on the worst day of my life, the day I buried my father and then discovered my brother had been planning to take what was mine. An old man I'd known since childhood drove over with coffee and a phone number and sat at my kitchen table and told me I wasn't alone. Theodore didn't have to do any of that. He wasn't involved. He could have expressed his condolences and stayed out of it. He chose not to. I used to think family was the people you were born to. I'm 34 years old and I'm learning slowly that it's actually the people who show up, not at the easy moments, at the impossible ones. With coffee and a name and the specific kind of steady that lets you catch your breath before you figure out your next move. My father knew that. He chose Theodore. He chose well. And in the end, because Theodore showed up, I got to keep the roses.